He burned everything he loved on the word of a woman who never loved him back. Alpha King Ronan Blackthorn stood in the ash of his own palace and called it justice. He called it strength. He called it necessary. That's what men like him do when they've been played. They dress their humiliation in the language of power so nobody can see them bleeding underneath. But the kingdom knew. The rivers knew. The stones beneath his boots knew the second he made the worst mistake of his life. This is the story of what it costs a king to be wrong. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from. The fire had not started on the night Ronan ordered the palace burned. It had started 3 years earlier, on the morning he first let Celine Voss into the war room. He remembered that morning the way men remember the exact moment before a blade finds the gap in their armor, with a strange, clarifying precision that only arrives too late. The light through the arched windows had been the color of hammered copper. His war chiefs sat along the obsidian table with the blunt, tired expressions of men who had spent the prior week negotiating border disputes. The air smelled of candle wax and wet stone. And then the doors opened, and Celine walked through them, and the entire room shifted without anyone moving an inch. She was not the most beautiful woman Ronan had ever seen. He had seen women who could stop a council chamber cold, women carved from the kind of bloodlines that produced warriors and seers, and lunabears whose power left marks in the ground where they stood. Celine was not that. She was something else. A particular quality of attention, a way of moving through a room like she already owned the floor plan, like every man present had been expecting her arrival and simply hadn't been told yet. She wore the gray of a court messenger. Her eyes moved across the room the way water moves across a table, finding every low point, every crack. She had been sent by the Eastern Trade Assembly to deliver a report on shifting supply routes through the mountain passes. She delivered it in 11 minutes, standing without notes, answering every challenge from Ronan's war chiefs with the steady efficiency of someone who had been answering hard questions since before these men had grown their beards. Ronan watched her the whole time. He told himself he was looking for deception. He was a king. Reading people was not a skill, it was survival. He had pulled men apart across this same table and found the lies folded inside them like letters, inside letters. He did not find the lie in Celine Voss that morning. That failure would eat 11 years of his life before he understood what it had actually cost him. Dad. His Luna, Aurelia Nightbane, had been in the east corridor when Celine's carriage arrived. Ronan knew this because one of the court runners had mentioned it, offhand, while relaying the morning's schedule. Aurelia had been walking the old section of the palace, the vaulted limestone corridors that ran along the original foundation, the parts of the building that predated even his grandfather's rule. She walked them most mornings. Ronan had asked her once what she was doing in those tunnels, early, before the court woke. "Listening," she said. "To what?" She looked at him the way she often did, not distant, not cold, but like someone hearing a question in a language they were being careful not to translate too quickly. "To the palace," she said. "It has a sound. Most days it's fine. Some days it isn't." He had thought it was ceremony, lunar ritual, something from her bloodline's older practices that he didn't need to understand so long as it didn't interrupt governance. He had not asked again. He thought about that now sometimes. He thought about it the way a man thinks about the last solid step before the ground gave out. Not with clarity, not with wisdom, just with the sick mechanical repetition of a mind that can't stop running the same track. Aurelia Nightbane had come to him through a bonding arranged by the High Council, not through courtship, not through conquest, not through any of the ways men in his bloodline had traditionally taken their lunas. She was the last of the Nightbane line, a name that carried weight in the old records and almost none in the present court. Her family had held lands in the northern foothills for generations before a succession of bad harvests and one catastrophically misjudged alliance had stripped them down to a single estate and a surname that people in the capital mispronounced on purpose. She arrived at the palace at 17 with 2 trunks, a maidservant, and the particular posture of someone who had decided very early that dignity was the one thing that couldn't be taken if you didn't hand it over. She was not warm with Ronan in those first years, but she was not cold either. She was careful. She learned the palace with the same unhurried attention she gave to everything, walking its corridors, sitting in its older rooms, sometimes pressing a hand flat against the stone walls like a woman checking a horse's flank for heat. She had never demanded his time. She had never made scenes. She sat beside him at council dinners and said the right things in the right register and wore the Luna's seal with the quiet authority of someone who understood exactly what the symbol meant and exactly how little the people in that room believed it. Ronan respected her, in the abstract way a man can respect something he doesn't fully look at. He did not love her. He told himself this was acceptable. He told himself a king's marriage was a political structure, not an emotional one. He told himself a great many things in those years that sounded reasonable in the space between the pillow and the ceiling at 3 a.m. Then Celine Voss came, and Ronan stopped having to tell himself anything. It did not happen fast. That was the part he would never forgive himself for. Not the falling, but the slowness of it, the deliberateness, the way he walked toward it with his eyes completely open and told himself every step of the way that he was still in control. Celine returned to the palace 6 months after that first meeting, this time at his invitation, officially as a trade consultant during the winter renegotiation season. She stayed in the East guest quarters. She attended 3 council sessions. She had dinner with Ronan twice in the formal dining chamber, with his steward present and proper protocol observed, because he was a king and he understood discretion. And then one evening she walked into the library where he was working late, alone, and sat down across from him without asking, and said, "You read old law texts for relaxation." It wasn't a question. He looked up. "You have 14 books open," she said, "and every one of them is pre-accord legal theory, the kind of reading that doesn't have a governance application anymore. You're doing it because you like it. Most people don't notice what's on my desk." "Most people are watching your face," she said. "I was watching your hands." He should have dismissed her. He should have called the steward back into the room. He should have done any number of things that an alpha king with 11 years of political discipline under his belt absolutely knew how to do. He did not do any of them. By the time the winter renegotiation concluded, Celine had become a permanent fixture in the palace's daily operations, officially as head of trade strategy, a new position Ronan created in a council session he barely let the chiefs argue against. She was exceptional at the work. That was the first defense he built around what was happening. She was useful. She was effective. The eastern supply routes she restructured saved the kingdom 11% on grain imports by the second quarter. She was also, within 6 months of her permanent appointment, the person Ronan had dinner with most evenings. Aurelia said nothing. This was the thing that would confuse him for years, the silence. He had expected, on some level, a confrontation, a demand, the cold fury of a Luna who had been displaced in her own home. He had braced for it the way a man braces for a punch he can see coming. When the punch didn't land, he told himself it meant she didn't care, that the bond between them had always been as thin as he suspected, that Aurelia's composure was simply absence dressed up in good posture. He was wrong. He would not understand how wrong until it was too late to do anything but live in the wreckage. What Aurelia actually did, during those months, was spend more time in the lower corridors, more time with her hand against the stone, more time listening. Yes. The first fire appeared in early spring, a year and 4 months after Celine's permanent appointment. It started in the sub-basement, the oldest section of the palace, the part that sat directly on the original foundation stones. A maintenance worker reported it. A faint blue light moving through the stone walls, not burning anything, not generating heat, just tracing lines through the rock like water through old channels. He reported it to the steward. The steward reported it to the palace engineer. The palace engineer descended with 2 assistants and spent an afternoon investigating before returning to the steward with the conclusion that it was most likely a naturally occurring phosphorescent mineral reaction, possibly triggered by groundwater shift, probably harmless, worth monitoring. The steward filed the report. Nobody told Ronan. Aurelia knew within a day. She came to him herself, walked into his council chamber during a gap between meetings, closed the door, and stood at the end of the table with her hands flat on the wood, the way she always stood when she had something to say that she'd already calculated the cost of saying. "There's a light in the foundation," she said. "Blue fire, moving." Ronan looked at her. He had not been alone with Aurelia in 3 weeks. He was aware of this in a way that sat badly. The engineer checked it. The engineer looked at stone, Aurelia said. I'm telling you about the fire. It's phosphorescent mineral. It's not. She said it without heat, without rushing, the same register she used for everything. I've been listening to the foundation of this palace for 11 years, Ronan. I know what it sounds like when it's healthy, and I know what it sounds like when something is wrong. This is wrong. He looked at her for a moment. He noticed, with the disconnected precision of a man who had stopped really looking at something, that she was tired. Not the surface tired of a bad night's sleep. Something deeper. Something that sat behind her eyes like weight. What do you think it is? He said. I think it's a distress signal, she said. From the bond. He did not ask which bond. He knew what the Luna bond was. He had known since childhood. The foundational covenant between a Luna and the land. The thing that made a kingdom more than territory and a palace more than stone. He had grown up understanding it as history, as ceremony, as something the old texts treated with reverence and the present court treated as tradition that didn't require active maintenance. The bond, he said. Yes. The bond is distressed. Yes. He looked at her, and then he looked at the door. And he thought about Celine waiting for him in the trade office down the corridor, and he said, I'll have the engineer do a more thorough assessment. Aurelia looked at him for 3 seconds, not with anger, not with accusation, with the expression of a woman who had already done the math on how this conversation would end and had come anyway, because not coming wasn't something she was willing to become. All right, she said. She pushed back from the table and walked to the door and opened it. Then she stopped, without turning around. Ronan. Her voice was the same, flat, careful, exactly calibrated. If you wait too long, waiting will be the choice. She left. He had the engineer do a more thorough assessment. The report came back in a week. Probably harmless, worth monitoring. 3 months later, Celine came to him with her eyes sharp and her voice carrying the particular quality it got when she had been thinking hard about something and had decided the time to say it was now. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to hear it without deciding how you feel about it before I finish. They were in the private garden off the east wing, late evening, the sky the color of old bruising. Ronan looked at her. He had learned to read her tells by then. The slight tension at the corner of her mouth that meant she was managing her delivery, the way her hands never fidgeted, the steadiness that she deployed like a tool. I've been watching Aurelia, she said. He said nothing. Not because I was looking for anything, because she watches me, Ronan, and I started paying attention to where she goes and when. She paused, perfectly timed. She spends hours in the foundation corridors, alone, every day. And the fire in the walls started 6 weeks after she increased that pattern. The garden was quiet. Somewhere behind the hedge, a nightbird was moving. You're suggesting she's causing it, Ronan said. I'm not suggesting anything, Celine said, which was, he would understand much later, one of the most sophisticated lies he had ever been told. I'm telling you what I've seen. What you do with it is your decision. Aurelia told me about the fire herself. She told you about it after it had already been reported by 3 other people, Celine said. She told you about it on her own terms, framing herself as the one who understood it, the one with the knowledge to interpret it. That's not the same as transparency. Ronan stood very still. I'm not your enemy's voice, Celine said, quieter now, the performance of reluctance perfect. I know how this sounds. I know you'll need to think about it. I couldn't keep watching something move toward you and say nothing. She touched his arm once, brief and deliberate, and went inside. He stood in the garden alone for a long time. The fire spread through the summer, still blue, still cold, still moving through the palace walls in those slow tracing lines that the engineers kept refiling as probably harmless. But it was more extensive now. It had climbed from the sub-basement to the second floor of the old wing. Workers reported seeing it at night, moving behind the stone like something alive. 3 kitchen staff resigned. 2 guards requested transfers to the outer wall posts and gave reasons that had nothing to do with the lights. Ronan started watching Aurelia. He had never done this before. never analyzed her movements, cataloged her schedule, noticed the pattern of her exits and entries. He noticed now with the cold, focused attention of a man who had decided he was investigating something rather than doing something far more complicated and much less defensible. He noticed that she was in the foundation corridors every morning before anyone else. He noticed that she sometimes emerged with her palms dusty and her hair loose, as if she had been moving fast. He noticed that she ate less than she used to at the evening table, and that the skin under her eyes had taken on a particular quality. Not illness exactly, more like the look of sustained expenditure. He did not ask her about any of it. He told himself he was waiting for more information. He was, in fact, afraid of what she'd say. Celine escalated in early autumn. She came to him not in private this time, but in the council chamber, with two of the war chiefs present, with documents spread on the table, heat mapping reports from the palace's structural maintenance team, overlaid with a schedule she had apparently compiled herself of Aurelia's documented movements through the foundation wing over the past 4 months. The correlation was meticulous. Every significant spread of the fire matched within 48 hours to a period when Aurelia's presence in the lower corridors had been recorded. "I'm not accusing the Luna," Celine said, standing at the head of the table with her hands flat on the documents. "I'm presenting data." War Chief Aldrich, who was 63 years old and had never in his life been accused of sentiment, looked at the charts and said, "This is a serious map." "It's a map of coincidences," Ronan said. He heard his own voice and recognized something in it that he didn't like, the sound of a man arguing a position he's not sure he holds. "Coincidences that are accelerating," Celine said. She looked at him directly, without aggression, without theater. Just that steady, reasonable gaze that had been working on him for over a year. "The fire is in the second floor now. If it reaches the central vault and the seal chambers, we will lose the archive. Possibly more." "What are you recommending?" Ronan said, very flat. "I'm not a council member," Celine said. "I'm a trade strategist. I don't recommend palace security decisions." A pause. "Precise. But if someone were to recommend something, I think it would look like finding out what's happening in those corridors before the building starts to come apart." Aldrich said, "I can have her detained for questioning." Ronan said, "No." The room was quiet. "I'll handle it," Ronan said. He went to Aurelia that night. She was in her rooms, the private chambers in the old wing that she had occupied since her arrival, that she had never once asked to change or expand, that still held the same 2 trunks she'd brought from the northern estate packed away in the corner as though part of her had always known this place would never entirely be home. She was sitting at the narrow writing desk when he came in, not writing, just sitting with her hands in her lap and the small oil lamp burning. She turned when she heard him. She did not look surprised. "Ronan," she said, "I need you to tell me the truth about the fire." "I've told you the truth about the fire." "You've told me it's a distress signal. You haven't told me from what." She looked at him. The lamp threw shadows across the bones of her face, and he thought, not for the first time and with the particular pain of a man who let himself notice something too late, that she was not beautiful in the way Celine was beautiful. She was something else, something that had more to do with structure than with surface, with the quality of the attention she gave the world and the economy with which she gave it. "You've been watching me," she said. Not accusing, naming. "Yes, because of what Celine told you." The name sat in the room differently than he expected. Aurelia said it the way you say the name of a weather event you've been tracking. Not with hatred, not with jealousy, with the flat precision of someone who has been taking notes. "Because the fire is spreading," he said, "and people are frightened, and I need to understand what I'm dealing with." "What you're dealing with," Aurelia said, and now something changed in her voice. Not anger, nothing so accessible as anger, but something older and more tired, is a kingdom whose foundational bond is fraying because the Luna maintaining it has been spending everything she has for 3 years just keeping it together, while her king looks everywhere except at her. The room was silent. "The bond is kept by attention," she said, "by presence, by—" She stopped, recalibrated, looked at him with that careful eyes. "It is not a metaphor, Ronan. The bond between a Luna and the land is not ceremony. It is a living thing. It requires energy. And I have been giving it everything I have because if I stop, the fire stops being a signal and starts being a symptom. He stood in the middle of her room and felt the particular vertigo of a man whose architecture of understanding has just taken on a different shape. Aurelia, I'm not asking you for anything, she said. I stopped asking you for things a long time ago. I'm telling you what is. The fire is not a threat. It is the bond calling for help the only way it knows how. If you want it to stop, the answer is not to chase it. The answer is to come back. She meant all of it, every layer, and Ronan stood there and felt the truth of it press against him like a physical thing, and he thought of Celine's charts and Celine's measured voice, and the way Celine's reasoning had always felt like a clear road when everything else felt complicated. He made his choice in that moment. He did not understand that it was a choice. He thought he was still investigating. I need more time, he said. Aurelia looked at him, a look that contained 11 years without sentimentality. All right, she said. Celine came to him 3 days later, not with charts this time, but with witnesses. 2 palace workers who reported seeing the Luna place her hands on the wall in the corridor near the central vault and watching the fire move faster immediately after. Their testimony was short, frightened, and delivered with the body language of people who believed what they were saying. Ronan questioned them himself. They did not waver. She's accelerating it, Celine said after the workers left. She's accelerating it deliberately, and when it reaches the vault, she will have compromised every critical seal in the palace. That is a play for the throne, Ronan. That is what a woman does when she has decided to stop waiting and start acting. Why? Ronan said. Give me a reason. Because she has nothing, Celine said. No children, no allies, no influence. She has been invisible in this court for over a decade, and invisibility eventually becomes unbearable. The fire is leverage. The fire is her telling you that she has always been able to do this, and you never bothered to find out. He sat with that for a long time. He thought about Aurelia's hands on the stone. He thought about her saying the bond requires energy. He thought about the way she had looked at him when she said, I stopped asking you for things a long time ago. He thought about how easy it was to believe the interpretation that made him a victim instead of the one that made him responsible. He called his war chiefs. Burn it, he said. Burn the old wing, all of it, before she can complete whatever she's building down there. Aldrich said, And the Luna? Ronan's jaw was granite. Get her out first. I'm not a murderer, but get her out and keep her contained until this is over. They burned it on a Thursday, in the gray cold of an early autumn dawn. Ronan stood in the eastern courtyard and watched the fire take the old wing, the real fire, the orange and red and ravenous fire of actual destruction, not the blue silent fire in the walls. He watched the limestone blacken and the roof beams collapse and the arched windows he had walked past 1,000 times lose their shape in the heat. Aurelia was in a holding room in the outer keep, under guard. She had not struggled when they came for her. She had looked at the guards with that same flat, careful expression and walked with them without a word. One of the guards told Ronan later, in a voice slightly off its usual register, that she had seemed to already know. The old wing burned for 6 hours. When it was finally ash and broken stone, Ronan stood at the edge of the ruin and felt, for the first time since the fire started, like he had done something decisive, like the threat had been addressed, like order had been restored. Then the river to the south of the palace grounds went silent. Not slow, not low. Silent. The sound of running water simply stopping, as if something downstream had sealed it off without warning or reason. Ronan turned. The river had been there since before the palace. It had been there since before the kingdom had a name. His grandfather had bathed in it. His father had made his border decisions with a cup of that water on the table, because the water had always run, because rivers did not simply stop. A runner came at a dead sprint from the western fields. The boy was 14, one of the crop watch apprentices, and he was white under his sun-darkened skin and breathing like he'd been running since before the sun came up. "My lord," he said, and then stopped because some reports the body delivers before the mouth can form the words. Ronan looked at him. The crops, the boy said. "The North Fields. They're—" He stopped again. "They're dead, my lord. All of them. Not dying. Dead. Like they went overnight." Ronan stood at the edge of the burned ruin, with the silent river to his south and the dead fields to his north, and felt the first real thing he had felt in months. Fear. Not the manageable fear of a king facing a known enemy. The deep structural fear of a man who has just done something he cannot undo and has not yet understood what it was. He turned back toward the outer keep. He needed to talk to Aurelia. He needed to talk to Aurelia right now. The guard captain met him at the keep entrance with an expression Ronan had never seen on that man's face. It took him a moment to name it. It was the expression of someone preparing to deliver news that might break something. "She's gone," the captain said. "We don't know how. The door was locked from the outside. The window was sealed. She was there at the 4th hour check, and when we went back at the 5th hour." "Gone," Ronan repeated. "Gone, my lord." The morning sky above the ruined wing was the gray of dead ash. The river was still silent. Somewhere in the northern fields, 11 seasons of harvest lay dead in the furrows without explanation. And the woman who was the only person who had ever told him the truth about any of it had walked out of a locked room and vanished into a kingdom that was already beginning, in ways Ronan could not yet see and could not yet name, to die. The river did not come back. Ronan stood at its bank the morning after and watched the channel, rock dry, the mud at the bottom already cracking into the jigsaw pattern of something that had been wet long enough to remember moisture and dry long enough to forget it. The water had not merely dropped, it had simply ended, like something had reached upstream and closed a fist. He crouched at the edge and pressed 2 fingers into the cracked mud. It was cold, not the cold of shade or of deep earth. A different cold, the cold of something that had been emptied rather than drained. Behind him, his war chief Aldrich stood with his hands behind his back and his mouth shut, which was how Aldrich communicated that he had opinions he hadn't been asked for. Ronan stood up. "Say it." "I haven't said anything." "You're breathing loud." Aldrich exhaled through his nose. "The North Crop report came in an hour ago. Full assessment. It's not just the surface growth. The roots are dead. Whatever happened went down into the soil. The Agrarian Council is saying it will take 3 seasons minimum to restore that ground, if it restores at all." A pause. "And we've had 2 more reports of the barrier lights going dim along the eastern ridge." Ronan looked at the dead river. "How dim?" "Dim enough that the border scouts are asking if they should expect incursion. The barriers are what keep the northern clans from testing the line, my lord. If word gets out that they're weakening—" "I know what the barriers do." "Then you know we have about 6 weeks before this stops being an internal problem." Ronan turned from the river. He walked back toward the palace. What remained of it, the main structure still standing, but the old wing nothing but scorched stone and open sky where the roof had been. He didn't look at it directly. A man could only take so much inventory of his own wreckage before it started to slow him down. "Find her," he said. "We've had 3 teams out since yesterday morning." "Find her faster." Celine was waiting for him in the strategy room. She was standing at the map table when he came in, her hands flat on the surface, her eyes moving across the territorial charts, with the focused expression of a woman doing calculations. She looked up when he entered, and something crossed her face. Not quite relief, not quite readiness, something that lived between those 2 things and dressed itself as concern. "I heard about the river," she said. "Everyone's heard about the river." He pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat. Not because he wanted to sit, because standing in front of her was beginning to feel like something he needed to think about, and he hadn't decided how to think about it yet. "Sit down." She sat. She folded her hands on the table. "Tell me your theory," he said. She looked at him. "My theory." "You had a theory 2 days ago, a theory that was compelling enough that I burned the wing. Now the river's gone and the crops are dead and the barriers are fading, and I want to hear how the theory accounts for that." The silence between them had a texture. He had noticed this before. The way Celine's silences were never neutral, never the empty space of someone thinking. They were constructed things, architecture. "Aurelia escaping changes the calculus," she said carefully. Escaping from a locked room, Ronan said, without a trace. Which tells us something about what she's capable of. Or tells us something about the theory. He watched her. He had learned her tells over a year of close proximity, and he was looking for them now, the way he'd never let himself look before. The slight tension at the jaw. The way her eyes didn't quite move to the left when she was doing what she claimed to be doing. Celine, the palace is burning, the land is dying. If you know something, if there is anything you haven't told me, now is the point at which that information becomes the difference between a kingdom and a ruin. She held his gaze for 4 seconds. He counted. I've told you everything I know, she said. He nodded once, slowly, filed it, moved on because moving on was the only direction that had any utility right now, and standing still in front of Celine Voss while the land died outside was a luxury he could not afford. I want the archive records pulled, he said. Everything on Luna bloodlines, everything on foundational bonds. I want scholars on it by this afternoon. The archive is in the old wing. He stopped. She said it without inflection. She didn't need to. He had burned the archive. He had burned the only comprehensive record of the exact system that was now dismantling his kingdom, and he had done it because a woman with a map of coincidences had walked him to that conclusion one careful, reasonable step at a time. There are secondary records, he said. His voice was even. He kept it even the way you keep pressure on a wound. The university in Cauldron, the council library. Find them. That will take time. Then start now. Up en masse. The first town report came in on the 4th day. A river village 3 hours south of the palace, a settlement that had existed for 200 years on the strength of that same southern waterway, had been abandoned overnight. Not evacuated. Abandoned. The scouts found food still on tables, work tools left in fields, the communal fire pit cold and empty. 47 families, gone before dawn. Ronan read the report standing up. He had stopped sitting at the council table. Sitting felt like waiting, and waiting felt like rot. They ran, Aldrich said. Word travels faster than we think. They saw the river die, and they didn't wait to see what died next. Or something moved them, said Kael, the youngest of the war chiefs, 29 years old, and the only one in the room who had no memory of the kingdom before Ronan's rule. The barrier lights on the eastern ridge. The scouts are saying they're not just dim. They're moving. Shifting position. Like something is... He stopped, looked for the right word. Like something is reorienting. Barriers don't reorient, Aldrich said. These ones are. The room was quiet. Ronan set the report down on the table. He thought about what Aurelia had said in her room, in the lamplight, with the careful precision of someone who had already done this calculation a dozen times before he arrived. The bond requires energy. He had been hearing those words on a loop for 4 days. He didn't know what to do with them except to let them run, because the alternative was to sit with what they meant about what he'd done, and he was not there yet. He was not capable of going there yet. A king who stops functioning in the middle of a collapse isn't doing penance. He's just adding to the damage. I want a full assessment of every territorial marker, every barrier point, every sacred ground site in the kingdom, he said, cross-referenced with the timeline. When did the river go silent relative to when we burned the wing? When did the crops die relative to that? I want to see the sequence clearly. You think it's connected, Kael said. I think everything that's dying is connected, Ronan said. I don't know the shape of it yet. He went looking for Aurelia himself on the 7th day. Not because the search teams had failed, they had tracked signs of her movement north, toward the foothills, toward the territory that bordered her family's original lands. They had found campsites, cold but recent. They had found places where she had stopped, where she had pressed her hands against the ground in the same way she pressed them against the stone walls of the palace, and left impressions in the earth that had not filled back in. He went himself because every day he waited was a day the sequence continued. And because something about the impressions in the earth, the shape of her palms in the cold dirt, the evidence of her simply being somewhere and attending to it, had gotten under his skin in a way he hadn't expected and couldn't quite wall off. He took Aldrich and 2 scouts and left the palace before the court was awake. The foothills were 4 hours north at Hard Ride. The land changed as they moved. The middle territory still looked ordinary, just dry, just quiet, the particular quiet of a place where the usual sounds had been subtracted. But as they pushed north, the change became more visible. Trees that should have been in full late-season foliage stood with their leaves curling inward, brown at the edges, like hands drawing back from something cold. The ground had a grayish cast to it, not the gray of stone or of frost, but something thinner, more fundamental, like the color had begun to drain from the surface. Aldrich said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I've seen drought. I've seen blight. I've seen soil sickness from bad flooding. This isn't any of those." "No," Ronan said. "This looks like the land is—" Aldrich stopped. "Giving up," Ronan said. Aldrich nodded once and said nothing more. They found the camp in the early afternoon, a shallow shelter against a granite outcrop, the remnants of a small fire, a bedroll made from what looked like materials she'd taken from the palace during her escape. The fire was cold but not old. 6 hours, maybe 8. One of the scouts crouched and touched the ground beside the fire ring. "She was here this morning," he said. "Moved out fast. She knew we'd follow the smoke." Ronan dismounted. He walked the perimeter of the camp slowly, not looking for tracks. The scouts would find those, looking for the other things. The texture of the space. Aurelia had been here. She had slept here. She had made fire and then put it out and moved before daylight, carrying whatever weight she was carrying, going somewhere in the gray foothills of her family's dead land. There was a stone at the edge of the camp, a flat piece of granite that she had clearly used as a seat. The surface was marked, not carved, pressed somehow, the way the earth had been pressed at her previous campsites. Her palm print, deep and clear in the surface of the rock, and radiating outward from it, a series of fine cracks in the stone that moved in a pattern that was not random. Ronan crouched in front of it. He pressed his own hand over the impression. His hand was larger. Her fingers had been close together, thumb tucked, the posture of someone bearing weight rather than pushing. "She's maintaining something," he said, half to himself. Aldrich crouched beside him, looked at the cracks, said slowly, "You think she's still—" "Holding the bond," Ronan said. "Even out here. Even running." He took his hand back from the stone. "Everything that's dying, guys, it's dying slower than it should if the bond were completely gone. Something is still slowing it down." "Her," Aldrich said. "Her. Running across the foothills, alone, putting her hands on rock and dirt and whatever she can reach and pouring herself into it." His jaw was stone. "Because she hasn't let go." He stood. The wind across the foothills was cold and dry and smelled of turned earth. "She hasn't let go," he said again, quieter, and what moved across his face in that moment was not something he would have let any of his war chiefs see if he'd known it was there. "Then we need to find her before she can't do it anymore," Aldrich said. "Yes. And when we find her, what do you say to a woman you burned out of her own home?" Ronan looked north, toward the higher ground, where the foothills broke into open ridge. Somewhere up there, Aurelia Nightbane was holding the world together with her bare hands for a kingdom that had thrown her out. "I don't know yet," he said. It was the most honest thing he had said in months. The second wave of reports hit while he was still in the foothills. A rider came at a dead run from the palace, a young man who had been riding since before dawn, who pulled up his horse so hard the animal made a sound, and whose face when he reached Ronan carried the specific stripped-down expression of someone who had looked at something they did not have the frame for. "My lord!" The rider's voice was rough with hours of wind. "The barriers on the eastern ridge, they didn't just fade. They're gone, completely. And the northern clan scouts have been spotted at the Ashford crossing." "How many?" "The count said 40. But my lord—" The rider stopped. "The barrier at the Morn Pass collapsed an hour after the ridge went. The entire northern corridor is open." Ronan's face didn't move. "If the Ashford and Morn are both open," Aldrich said very quietly, "then we have no eastern defense at all. The clans can walk through." "They won't walk," Ronan said. "They'll run." He turned to the scouts. "We're going back." "My lord, the trail is fresh." "I know." He mounted. "Mark the direction. I'll come back." He rode south with the knowledge sitting in his chest like a stone dropped into deep water. The weight of it, the long, slow fall, the fact that there was no bottom he could yet see. And riding south, with the gray foothills receding behind him and the dead fields opening up ahead, he finally stopped lying to himself about the sequence. He had burned the palace. The land began to die. He had hunted Aurelia across her own kingdom. She was still out there, still bleeding into the ground to keep it alive, and it was not enough. It was not enough because the bond had been severed at its root by the fire, and no amount of Aurelia pressing her hands into cold granite could hold together what he had broken. He had done this. Not Aurelia, not Celine, not yet. He wasn't there yet. But the shape of that truth was beginning to surface in the water, the way shapes surface when the depth starts to change. He had done this. In the name of justice, in the name of security, in the name of a clear road that had been built for him, brick by brick, by someone who knew exactly how a man like him needed his conclusions to arrive. The eastern corridor was open. The clans were moving. The land was dying, acre by acre. And somewhere in the Cauldron University archive, a scholar was pulling records on Luna bloodlines and foundational bonds that should have been the first documents Ronan read before he ever lit a match. And those records were going to tell him something he already knew in his body, in his gut, in the place where certainty lives before a man's mind catches up. The rider who met him at the palace gates was not breathing right. That was the first thing Ronan noticed. The second thing he noticed was that the man was holding a message in both hands, the way you hold something you don't know how to put down. From the scholar in Cauldron, the rider said. My lord, he says, you need to read it before you do anything else. He says if you've been hunting the Luna, you need to stop. He says, Ronan took the message. He read the first line. He read it again. The ground under his boots was the same ground it had always been, the same packed earth of the palace courtyard. But it felt different now. It felt the way ground feels when you understand for the first time that it is not simply the floor of the world, but the ceiling of everything underneath. He folded the message. He turned to Aldrich, who was watching him with the eyes of a man reading damage assessment. Pull the hunt teams back, Ronan said. His voice was a different thing than it had been this morning. All of them, now. My lord. Now, Aldrich. He walked toward the palace entrance. He did not look at Celine, who was standing at the top of the stairs. She had been there when he rode in. She was always there when something was happening. He had called that attentiveness for a year. He had called it dedication, investment, the quality of a woman who cared about the work. He was beginning to call it something else. Ronan, Celine said from the top step. What did the message say? He stopped at the base of the stairs. He looked up at her. The afternoon light was behind her, and he could not read her expression, but he could read her posture. The very slight forward lean, the quality of waiting that was not patience but calculation. It said, Ronan answered, that the Luna doesn't just maintain the bond. Celine was still. It said the Luna is the bond, he said, has always been the bond, that the bloodline doesn't carry the power. It is the power. That without Aurelia Nightbane alive and present and intact, this kingdom does not have a weakening foundation. He held the message at his side. His knuckles were white. It has no foundation at all. He looked at Celine for a long moment. And I drove her out, he said. Because you showed me a map. The silence on the stairs was the loudest thing he had ever heard. Celine opened her mouth. Whatever she had prepared, whatever the next careful sentence was, the next precisely constructed piece of architecture, he didn't let it arrive. Don't, he said. Quiet, hard as the burned stone. Whatever you're about to say, don't. He went inside. Behind him, the first scout report of the morning was already riding in from the northern border. Not 40 clan soldiers at the Ashford crossing, 200, and moving fast. 200 clan soldiers at the Ashford crossing meant war by morning if nothing changed. Ronan understood this the way a man understands the temperature of a blade, not as information processed at a distance, but as a physical fact that arrives in the body before the mind has finished receiving it. He stood in the war room with the updated scout report in his hand and felt the kingdom contract around him like a fist closing, and he thought, This is what the bottom looks like. He had believed, until today, that there was more floor beneath him. There was not. Aldrich had the war chiefs assembled within the hour. 6 men around the obsidian table, all of them carrying the compressed tension of soldiers who have seen enough campaigns to know when a situation has moved past strategy and into survival arithmetic. The scout maps were spread across the table. The barrier collapse was marked in red. Morn Pass, Eastern Ridge, Ashford Crossing. 3 lines of defense, all of them open. We have one functioning barrier left, Aldrich said. The southern marker, and only because the land there is still holding. Barely. How long? Ronan said. Days. Maybe less if whatever is happening to the ground accelerates. War Chief Brennan, who was built like a quarried stone and spoke accordingly, said, Then we pull the garrison from the outer keeps and fortify the capital. We can hold the city walls for 3 weeks minimum against a clan force that size. We hold the city walls while the land dies outside them, Cale said. We hold the city walls while we solve the land problem, Brennan said. The land problem requires the Luna, Cale said, and looked at Ronan directly. My lord, that's what the scholar's report said. There is no military solution to what is happening to this kingdom. There is only finding Aurelia Nightbane. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when someone has said the exact true thing that everyone else has been navigating around. Ronan set the scout report down on the table. He pressed 2 fingers against the surface and looked at the red lines on the map, and he thought about the palm print in the granite rock in the foothills, the fine cracks radiating outward, the evidence of a woman pouring herself into cold stone for a kingdom that had thrown her into the dark. I know, he said. He walked out of the war room. Celine was not in the trade office, where she was supposed to be. She was not in the East Wing guest chambers, where she lived. She was not in any of the 3 most likely places a woman in her position would occupy at midday in a palace running crisis protocols. Ronan found her in the records hall, the secondary archive, the one that had not burned, the one where the scholars had been pulling Luna bloodline documentation since his order 4 days ago. She was standing at the central table with a scroll open in front of her, her back to the door, and she did not hear him come in because the records hall had been built with thick walls and a heavy floor, and the sound of the corridor did not follow a man through its entrance. He stood in the doorway for 3 seconds and watched her. She was reading fast. Her left hand was on the scroll to hold it flat. Her right hand was moving across the text the way you move across something you are looking for rather than something you are learning. The difference was in the urgency. She was searching, not studying. Her eyes tracked left to right in the rapid mechanical sweep of a woman who already knew the territory and was locating a specific landmark. She found it. He could tell by the way her hand stopped moving. She was still for 4 seconds, reading whatever she had found. Then she reached into the fold of her jacket and withdrew a small blade, the kind carried for letter opening, for cutting cord, for tasks that required a short, sharp edge. And she brought it down against the scroll. She was cutting out a section of the text. Ronan crossed the room in 6 steps. She heard him on the 3rd step and spun, and for one moment, one raw, unguarded moment, her face was completely undefended. He had never seen it before. In a 1.5 years of close proximity, he had never once seen Celine Voss without the architecture up. What he saw in that one moment was not guilt, not fear in the ordinary sense. It was the specific expression of a person whose calculation has just been interrupted before it could complete, and the interruption itself is the catastrophe. Then the architecture came back. It took less than a second. Ronan. He took the scroll from her hand. He looked at the cut edge, the clean removal of whatever section she had been after. He looked at her. Sit down, he said. I can explain. Celine. His voice was the flattest thing in the room. Sit down. She sat. She placed the blade on the table between them. He didn't know if that was a concession or a performance. He didn't know anything about her with certainty anymore, and the recognition of that fact, the full cellular recognition of it, was doing something to him that he did not have a name for yet. It was not anger. Anger was something he knew. This was bigger than anger and colder, and it lived in the place where a man's understanding of himself intersects with his understanding of what he's allowed to happen. He sat across from her. He put the mutilated scroll between them. "What did it say?" he said. It was a secondary account. Fragmentary. Not relevant to... What did it say? She looked at him. The expression on her face was one he recognized from the council chamber, from the garden, from every moment she had sat across from him with a narrative she had already assembled before he arrived. But this time something underneath it was different. This time the expression was load-bearing in a way it hadn't needed to be before. It described a method, she said slowly, an old one, for accelerating the degradation of a foundational bond. The records hall was very quiet. "Accelerating it," Ronan said. "Yes." "Not a natural degradation." "No." He looked at the mutilated scroll. He thought about the blue fire in the palace walls that had appeared 18 months ago, that the engineers had called natural, that the engineers had not known how to read because the engineers had not had access to the secondary archive where this scroll had been sitting intact until approximately 4 minutes ago. "How long?" he said. She didn't answer. "How long does it take," he said, "to degrade a foundational bond using that method?" She was very still. 18 months, she said, to 2 years, depending on the strength of the bond at the outset. He did not move. He was aware of his own breathing, slow, even. The breathing of a man doing everything in his power not to let what he was feeling change the surface of him before he had all the information. Because information was the only thing he had left, and he was going to get every piece of it before he did anything else. "The fire in the walls started 18 months ago," he said. Silence. "You came to the palace 20 months ago," he said. Silence. "Celine." He leaned forward just slightly. "You started it." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something moved across her face. Not remorse, nothing so clean as remorse. It was more like the expression of a person who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has arrived at the moment where the carrying ends and something else begins, and they are not sure yet whether that something else is relief or ruin. "I accelerated what was already weakening," she said. "The bond was not..." "Stop!" He stood up. He moved away from the table because he needed to not be sitting when she said the next thing. He needed to be on his feet. "Don't build me something. Don't give me a structure. Tell me the straight line." She looked at him across the table. The blade was between them. The mutilated scroll. "The Voss Assembly," she said, "wants the Northern Territory. They have wanted it for 3 generations. The only obstacle has always been this kingdom's foundational protection. The barriers, the bond, the power that keeps the land cohesive enough to hold against outside pressure. If the bond could be degraded slowly enough to look natural..." She stopped. If someone could be positioned inside the court with enough trust to guide the king toward decisions that accelerated the process without appearing to, Ronan said. "Yes." He put his back against the far wall and looked at her from across the room and felt the shape of it come together, the way shapes come together in the dark, when your eyes have been in it long enough. Every decision, every carefully timed conversation, every map, every witness, every piece of evidence that had arrived in exactly the right form at exactly the right moment to produce exactly the conclusion she needed him to reach. He had not been governed by his feelings for Celine Voss. He had been governed by her. The distinction arrived in his chest, like something structural giving way. "The workers who testified," he said. "The ones who said they watched Aurelia accelerate the fire." "Hired," she said. "Flat now. No architecture. Just the facts, finally, in their actual shape." "From outside the palace. They left the kingdom the morning after they testified." "The evidence you brought to the council." "Constructed. The heat maps were real. The correlation with Aurelia's movements was... The movements were real too. She was genuinely trying to maintain the bond. The correlation was real. The interpretation was mine." He was quiet for a long time. Somewhere in the distance, outside the thick walls of the records hall, he could hear the sounds of the palace under military preparation. Boots on stone, the clank of armoring, the particular cadence of a garrison shifting into defensive posture. The sounds of a kingdom getting ready to defend itself against the consequences of the last 18 months. "She knew," he said. Not a question. Aurelia? Celine paused. She knew something was wrong with the bond. She told you that directly. She didn't know the source. She told me, he said. She came to me herself. She stood in my council chamber and told me the palace had a sound and the sound was wrong, and I... He stopped. He did not finish that sentence. There was no version of finishing it that did not end in a kind of self-recognition he had to earn before he could bear. You were grievable, Celine said. Not cruel, just precise. As if she was doing him the last courtesy of an honest account. Not weak, not stupid. You had the pride structure of a man who has always had to be right to be safe, and the loneliness structure of a man who hadn't been truly known by anyone in years. Those two things together. She looked at him. I am very good at my work, Ronan. That is not a defense. It is a fact. He looked at her from across the room. He had built this woman an empire inside his own court. He had given her access, authority, influence, the key to his decision-making. He had looked at everything she handed him and called it intelligence because intelligence was a category he trusted and manipulation was a category he believed himself immune to because he was an alpha king, and alpha kings were the ones who did the maneuvering, not the ones it was done to. He had been wrong about himself. For 2 years he had been wrong about himself, and the cost of that error was currently massing at the Ashford crossing. Is there more? He said. What do you mean? Is there anything else I don't know? Any other piece? She was quiet for a moment. The Voss Assembly has a contact in the Alpha Council, she said. I won't tell you who until I know what you're planning to do. He almost laughed. He did not. What I'm planning to do, he said, is find my Luna, if she can still be found, and see whether I have destroyed beyond repair the only thing standing between this kingdom and complete collapse. He moved to the door. And then I'm going to come back here and deal with you. Ronan! Her voice behind him had a quality it hadn't carried before. Not fear, something more complicated. She's been running for 8 days. She's been maintaining the bond the entire time. Alone. A foundational hold that size. She stopped. She may not have much time left. It drains the body. He stopped at the door. He did not turn around. I know, he said. He went out. He left her sitting at the table with the mutilated scroll and the small blade, and the particular silence of a woman who has spent 2 years building an outcome and is now waiting to find out what the rubble looks like. He pulled Aldrich into the corridor outside the records hall and told him in 37 words what he needed to know. Aldrich's face did not move through most of it. At the end, something in his jaw tightened. The contact in the Alpha Council, Aldrich said. I don't know who yet. Lock down internal communications. Nothing goes out of this palace to the council without my direct approval until I've dealt with Celine and gotten more information. And Celine? Under guard. In her chambers. No one in and no one out. She does not leave this palace and she does not communicate outside it. You're not yet. He met Aldrich's eyes. When this is over, she'll answer for it in front of every alpha on the council. I want witnesses. I want a record. I want the Voss Assembly to watch it happen in public. He pulled his riding gloves from his belt. Right now I need to find Aurelia. Aldrich looked at him. 63 years old, 3 kings served, the kind of man who had seen enough to have stopped being surprised by what men were capable of. He was not unsurprised. The northern route will be closed by tomorrow if the clans push through Ashford, he said. I know. If you're going to find her, it has to be tonight. I know. And if she can't, if the bond is... Aldrich stopped. He was not a man who left sentences unfinished as a habit. He finished this one. If it's too far gone, Ronan, what then? Ronan pulled on the first glove, then the second. He looked at the far wall of the corridor. The old stone, the same limestone that had lined these halls for 200 years, that had been here before his grandfather's name meant anything, that had carried the weight of this kingdom's history in its grain and its mortar. Then I figure out what a king does, he said, when the thing he broke can't be fixed. He walked toward the stable. Outside, the sun was going down behind the dead fields, and the light it made was the color of old ash, and the kingdom was very quiet in the specific way things go quiet when they are deciding whether to continue. Ronan rode north into it. Behind him, in the records hall, the mutilated scroll lay on the table. The removed section, the part Celine had cut away, was folded inside her jacket. The method she had used. The evidence of what had been done. She had not been fast enough, but she was still the only person alive who knew the full shape of what she had built. And somewhere in that shape, in the architecture of 2 years of careful destruction, was the question Ronan had not yet asked. Not how Celine had done this, but who else in his court had helped her do it, and whether that person was still standing close enough to finish what she had started. The scout at the northern gate looked at Ronan as he passed and said, "My lord, the clan count at Ashford was updated an hour ago." Ronan did not slow his horse. 300 now, the scout said, and they're not waiting at the crossing, they're moving. He found her at the old Nightbane boundary stone. It was 3 hours north of the palace at Hard Ride, at the point where the foothills broke open into the flat granite shelf that had marked the edge of her family's land for 2 centuries. The boundary stone was chest-high, rough-cut, older than anything in the palace archive. Someone had carved a single mark into its face generations ago. Not a word, not a symbol from any living tradition, just a vertical line with 2 short horizontal cuts, the kind of mark that meant occupied, meant present, meant we were here. Aurelia was on her knees in front of it, both palms flat against the stone. Her head dropped forward, her hair loose and tangled, the kind of loose that comes from days without attention rather than hours. She was wearing the same clothes she'd left in, the gray court dress, now dark with ground-in dirt at the knees and torn at the left sleeve. Her shoulders were moving with her breath, and the breath was wrong. Too shallow, too fast. The breathing of a body that has been running its reserves past the point of replenishment and has started pulling from somewhere deeper. Around the boundary stone, the earth was dead for a radius of 6 feet in every direction. Beyond that radius, the land was ordinary foothills grass, dry but alive. Inside it, gray, ash-colored. The same draining he had been seeing across the kingdom, but concentrated here, pulled here, like the bond was bleeding out through her hands, and she was feeding it everything she had to keep it from collapsing entirely. Ronan dismounted 20 feet back. He did not rush the approach. He walked toward her the way you walk toward something that might startle. Slow, deliberate, with his hands visible and his boots loud enough on the stone to announce him. She did not look up. "I know it's you," she said. Her voice was rougher than he had ever heard it, like something had been scraped out of it. "I could hear the horse." He stopped 6 feet from her, 6 feet from the edge of the dead circle. "Aurelia, don't." She still didn't look up. "Don't say my name like that yet. I need another minute." He waited. He stood in the cold foothills wind and watched her work. Because that was what it was, he understood now. The pressing of hands against stone was not ceremony, not ritual in the empty sense he had always assigned to it. It was labor. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, in the tendons standing out along the backs of her hands, in the tremor that moved through her arms every 30 seconds, like a body fighting to hold a door closed against something pushing from the other side. After a minute, she lifted her head. She took her hands off the stone. She looked at her palms. He could see from where he stood that the skin was raw, red, the kind of abrasion you get from sustained pressure against rough surface. She pressed them flat against her thighs and turned on her knees to look at him. Her face was the worst thing he had seen in 8 days. Not because of the physical exhaustion, though that was visible in every line of it. Because of what was behind the exhaustion. Not anger, not grief, not any of the things he had been bracing for. Just a kind of stripped clarity. The expression of a person who has been down to the bottom of themselves and found out what's actually there when everything else burns away. "You read the scholar's report," she said. "Yes." "How much of the kingdom?" "The northern barriers are gone. 2 southern markers are failing. The clan force at Ashford is 300 and moving." He crouched down to her level because standing over her felt wrong in a way he didn't have language for yet. "The river is still dry. The north fields are dead." She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, the clarity was still there, unbroken. "How long have I been out here?" 8 days. She nodded, like she had lost count and the confirmation cost something. "I've been trying to... the boundary sites. The old markers. They hold better than open ground. There's existing structure to anchor to. But it's..." She stopped. "It's like trying to fill a basin with a hole in the bottom. I can slow the loss. I can't stop it. Not out here. Not alone. I know. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since he had arrived, with the full attention she gave everything, that careful, unhurried accounting. Why did you come yourself? She said. Because I owe you that. You owe me a great deal more than showing up. Yes, he said, I do. The wind moved across the granite shelf and Aurelia pulled her knees to her chest and sat back against the boundary stone and looked at him with those stripped, clear eyes, and Ronan Blackthorn, Alpha King, sovereign of a dying kingdom, held her gaze and did not look away, because looking away was the thing he had done for 2 years, and he was finished with it. Celine built the fire, he said, in the walls. There's a method, old, documented in the secondary archive. She had it cut out of the record today. I caught her doing it. He watched Aurelia's face. She was commissioned by the Voss Assembly to degrade the foundational bond from the inside. The plan was to position herself in the court, guide me toward decisions that accelerated the process, and open the kingdom to outside pressure once the barriers failed. Aurelia was quiet for a long moment. She told you this, she said, when I had the evidence in front of her, yes. And the workers who testified against me? Hired, gone from the kingdom the next morning. Something moved across Aurelia's face. Not surprise, something older than surprise, something that lived on the other side of it. The expression of a person who has been holding a suspicion for so long that its confirmation feels less like revelation and more like the last piece of a weight settling into its full shape. I knew something was wrong with the bond's degradation pattern, she said. The natural rate should have been much slower. I thought... She stopped. I thought it was me, that I wasn't enough, that the bond was weakening because I wasn't... She pressed her lips together. Because you weren't... She stopped again. Say it, Ronan said. Because the bond requires both of us, she said. A Luna's life force and an Alpha's presence. Not sentiment, not love necessarily, but acknowledgement, recognition. The foundational bond isn't a solo hold. It was never meant to be. I was trying to maintain it alone because you had... She looked at the dead earth around the boundary stone. I was compensating for an absence, and Celine was accelerating the degradation on top of that. I couldn't tell which damage was which. He sat down on the stone in front of her, not crouching, sitting, on the cold granite in the foothills wind, across from the woman who had been holding his kingdom together with her bare hands while he burned the floor out from under her. I need you to come back, he said. She looked at him. Not to the palace. The old wing is... He stopped. What's left of the palace? And not because I'm ordering it. I'm not ordering anything. He put his forearms on his knees and looked at her directly. I need you to come back because without you there is no kingdom, and I am asking you, as one person to another, not as a king to a Luna. The wind was the only sound for a moment. You understand, Aurelia said carefully, that coming back doesn't fix what you did. Yes. That restoring the bond doesn't mean restoring anything else. Yes. And you're asking anyway. I'm asking anyway. She looked at him for a long time. The kind of looking that isn't about reading a face, but about reading something underneath it. The architecture of intention. The difference between a man who has arrived at the right words and a man who has arrived at the right place. Ronan sat still under it. He did not perform contrition. He did not construct anything. He had spent 2 years in the presence of a woman who built everything she showed him, and he had finally understood the difference between that and a person simply being what they were. He was just a man sitting on cold stone who had broken something irreplaceable and knew it. All right, Aurelia said. She put her hand on the boundary stone and used it to push herself to standing. Her legs were unsteady. He rose instinctively and offered his arm, and she took it after a half-second pause, and that half-second contained more information than any conversation they had ever had. They walked back toward his horse. 300 clan soldiers, she said, as they walked. Her grip on his arm was firm despite the exhaustion. How long before they reached the capital? Aldrich's estimate is 8 hours if they move without stopping, 6 if they push. And the southern barrier, the one that's still holding. Failing, hours. She processed this the way she processed everything, without without drama, with the flat efficiency of a woman doing active triage. If we can get back and I can anchor to the central foundation site, the original stone, not the palace build, the original, I may be able to stabilize the southern barrier long enough to rebuild the eastern markers. She paused. May, the degradation is extensive, and She looked at her own hands. I'm not in the best condition. What do you need? She glanced at him sideways. A look he hadn't seen from her in years. Not the careful, calculated attention, not the stripped-down clarity of the last 20 minutes. Something that had more edge to it, and more underneath the edge, the quality of a person deciding whether to say the real thing or the polite version. I'll tell you when I know if I can actually do this, she said. He helped her mount. He swung up behind her because she was in no condition to ride alone and because the horse was faster with one rider directing, and he knew these hills. She didn't object. She held the pommel and leaned slightly forward, and he gave the horse its direction, and they rode south at a pace that was not quite a full run, but close enough that conversation became impossible. He was aware of her breathing against his chest, and the tremor that still moved through her arms at intervals, and the smell of 8 days in the field. Cold stone and dried grass, and the particular sharpness of a body that has been burning itself as fuel. He was aware that he was asking her to do more of what had already nearly killed her. He was aware that she was going to do it anyway, and that the fact of her willingness was not a testament to anything he had done right. It was a testament entirely to who she was. These were the things you understood when it was almost too late to use the understanding for anything. They came in through the eastern gate as the sun hit the midpoint of its fall. Aldrich met them in the courtyard with a face that had compressed itself into the expression of a man running 4 crises simultaneously and has just received information that is either the answer or a 5th crisis, and cannot yet tell which. Ashford scouts updated 20 minutes ago, he said, looking between Ronan and Aurelia. The clan force split. 200 pushing for the capital, the other 100 turned south. We think they're targeting the cauldron passes to cut off retreat routes. Ronan dismounted and helped Aurelia down. She steadied herself with one hand on the horse's flank and then let go and stood on her own. The council contact, Ronan said to Aldrich. Celine's inside man. We have a lead. Kael is running it down now. Could be another hour. We don't have another hour. Ronan looked at him. Lock down every council member until we know. Nobody sends word out. Nobody receives word in. I don't care who objects. Aldrich's jaw moved. That will cause... I know what it will cause. Do it. Aldrich went. Ronan turned back to Aurelia. She was looking at the ruins of the old wing, at the blackened stone and the open sky where the roof had been. Her expression was unreadable, not the careful control he had learned to interpret as suppressed feeling. Something past that, a kind of reckoning that happened in the body before it arrived in the face. The original foundation site, he said. I'll take you. I know where it is. She said it without inflection. I've always known where it is. She walked toward it. He fell into step beside her. Not because she needed him to lead, but because walking beside her was the minimum correct thing, and he was going to do the minimum correct things until he could figure out the larger ones. The original foundation site was in the center of what had been the old wing's basement. Accessible now through the ruin, through fallen beams and fractured stone, the pathway in made navigable only because the fire had collapsed the upper structure straight down and left a corridor of open space along the original eastern wall. Aurelia walked through it without hesitating. She stepped over fallen beams, went around collapsed sections, moved through the ruin with the ease of a woman who had walked these corridors 10,000 times before the fire took them. Ronan followed, watching where she put her feet, watching the steadiness return to her as she moved closer to the center. The original foundation stone was a single massive piece of bedrock that the palace had been built around and above, never over, for 2 centuries. It was not celebrated. It was not marked. It sat in the center of the old wing's basement like an unmarked fact, gray, ancient, indifferent to everything that had been built above it. Aurelia stopped in front of it. She stood very still for a moment with her eyes on the stone. Then Ronan's second-in-command, a man named Drav, who had been with him for 9 years, came at a run through the ruin from the western entrance, and his face carried the particular damage of someone bearing information that changes the shape of the ground. "My lord," Drav said, breathing hard. "The council contact, it's Brennan." The name landed in the ruined space like a stone dropped into water. War Chief Brennan, 60 years old, garrison commander, the man who had been the first to recommend fortifying the city walls. The man who had been present in the council chamber when Celine brought her maps. The man who had access to every military communication the palace had sent or received for the last 2 years. "Where is he?" Ronan said. "We can't find him," Drav said. "He's not in the palace. His quarters are cleared, and my lord—" Drav stopped, got his breath. "The garrison at the southern marker. He gave them orders this morning before the lockdown. Recall orders." He pulled them off the post. The southern barrier. The one still holding. The only functional defense left. "The barrier," Ronan said. Drav's face answered before his words did. "It went down 7 minutes ago," he said. "The southern corridor is open." Ronan stood in the ruin of the thing he had burned, with the clan force pushing from the north and east and south, with his war chief gone and the last barrier collapsed, with the kingdom opened on every side and nothing between the capital and 300 soldiers except the distance they hadn't crossed yet. He turned to Aurelia. She had her palms flat on the foundation stone. Her eyes were closed. She was breathing in the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone going to a place inside themselves that takes everything they have to reach. Her hands were shaking. "Aurelia," he said. "I heard," she said, without opening her eyes. "I know. Can you—" "I don't know yet. Be quiet." He was quiet. He stood in the ruined space and watched her work and felt the helplessness of it. The particular helplessness of a man who has spent his entire life as the solution and has arrived at the moment where the solution is someone else, and all he can do is not interfere. The tremor in her arms was worse than it had been at the boundary stone. He could see it in her shoulders, in the tendons of her neck. Whatever she was doing at the foundation stone, it was costing more than she had left to spend. Drav was still standing at the entrance, waiting for orders that Ronan did not have. "Get Aldrich," Ronan said. "Tell him we hold the walls with whatever we have. Every guard, every trained staff member, every person in this palace who can hold a line. We buy time." "For what?" Drav said. Ronan looked at Aurelia, her hands against the stone, her breath slow and terrible. "For her," he said. Drav went. The ruin was quiet except for the wind through the open roof and the sound of Aurelia breathing. Then, under his boots, in the stone of the original foundation, Ronan felt something move. Not a tremor, not a structural shift. Something older than that, something that had been dormant and was now not awake, not yet, but stirring, like a current beginning to find its direction, like a river remembering it was meant to run. He looked at Aurelia. The shaking in her arms had reached her whole body now. Her head had dropped forward, her hair curtaining her face. She was making no sound, the not-making sound of a person who has decided that sound is a resource they can't spare. "Aurelia," I said, "be quiet. You're going to hurt yourself." "Ronan." She did not lift her head. Her voice was completely, eerily calm. "If I stop now, the clan soldiers will be inside the walls by nightfall, and there will be no kingdom left to argue about, so either help me or be quiet. Those are your options." He stood very still. "How do I help you?" he said. She was quiet for 10 seconds. The trembling did not stop. "Put your hand on the stone," she said. He stepped forward. He put his right hand flat on the foundation stone beside her left, the way she had shown him without ever showing him, the way she had tried to explain across 11 years of him not quite listening. The stone under his palm was cold and rough and utterly ordinary. Then it was not. Something moved through his hand and up his arm. Not pain, not warmth, something with no adequate name, a kind of pressure that was also a kind of recognition, the sensation of a circuit finding its missing connection. He felt it travel through him, and he heard Aurelia exhale, a single, broken exhale, like something that had been held too long finally releasing. And the trembling in her body went from violent to steady, and the current in the stone went from stirring to running. Outside in the distance, something made a sound that was not thunder. The southern barrier. It was coming back. Ronan kept his hand on the stone and looked at the open sky above the ruin, and above the sky the light was already changing. The dead color of ash replaced by something he did not have a name for, a quality of the air that he had not noticed was missing until it was coming back. And then his hand was grabbed at the wrist. Not Aurelia's hand, she was still on the stone. And he turned, and Brennan was standing in the ruin entrance with 4 men behind him that Ronan did not recognize. Men built like soldiers, but wearing no kingdom colors. And Brennan had the face of a man who has been carrying a plan for 2 years and is looking at the moment where the plan either completes or dies. "Step away from the stone," Brennan said. "Both of you." Ronan looked at him. The man he had trusted with garrisons, with border command, with the military spine of the kingdom, 9 years. "If she drops the hold now," Brennan said, "it's over. The barriers won't recover. The clan force walks in unopposed, and the Voss Assembly negotiates terms." He held Ronan's gaze with the flat steadiness of a man who has already made his peace with the choice. "This doesn't have to be a massacre. Step away from the stone and it's a transition. Orderly. Nobody dies who doesn't have to." Beside Ronan, Aurelia's breathing was ragged and precise, and she had not moved her hands. "Aurelia," Ronan said quietly. "I heard him," she said. "Don't stop." "I'm not planning to." A pause. "But Ronan, whatever you're going to do it now." Brennan took a step forward. The 4 men with him spread to either side, filling the entrance. Armed, ready. The particular readiness of men who have been waiting for this specific moment for longer than this conversation. Ronan took his hand off the foundation stone. He turned to face them. He had no weapon on him. He had ridden out with his riding gloves and his urgency and nothing else. And he stood in the ruin of everything he had built and broken with his hands empty at his sides. And Brennan was 12 feet away with 4 armed men and the advantage of preparation. Everything a man thought he was got tested eventually. Rank, bloodline, authority, the name he had built over 20 years of ruling. None of it changed the arithmetic of 4 armed bodies against 1 unarmed one. What remained when all of that was stripped was simpler and older. And either enough or it wasn't. Ronan exhaled. He moved. He took the first man down before Brennan finished drawing breath. Not clean. There was nothing clean about it. Ronan crossed the 12 feet of ruined stone floor in 4 strides and hit the nearest soldier with his full weight, before the man had finished spreading to position, driving an elbow into the jaw and using the recoil to put distance between himself and the blade that came in from the left. The blade caught him along the outer forearm, a line of fire, not deep, the kind of cut that meant business without finishing it. He caught the wrist on the follow-through and broke it against a fallen beam. 2 men now, repositioning. Brennan stepping back, not a fighter himself, but watching with the eyes of a man calculating how long this takes and whether it changes anything. Ronan understood, in the fractured seconds of it, something that no amount of training had ever made fully concrete. A man fighting for something real moved differently than a man fighting for position. He had fought for position his entire life, borders, councils, the maintenance of an authority that he had never once questioned whether he deserved. This was different. Behind him, 8 feet back, Aurelia's breath was audible in the ruined silence, and the foundation stone was running its current, and the thing he was protecting was not a kingdom or a seat of power. It was a woman on her knees pouring the last of herself into the ground. That distinction moved through his limbs like information. The second man came in low. Ronan took the hit across the ribs, felt something shift in the impact, not breaking, but close, and got his forearm across the man's throat and put him down hard against the fractured stone floor. The third soldier hesitated, half a second. That was enough. Ronan straightened. His arm was bleeding down the wrist, and his ribs were screaming, and he was breathing through his mouth in the way of a body that has been pushed and is pushing back harder. He put himself between the remaining men and the foundation stone and looked at Brennan. Brennan had a blade in his hand now, not held the way a fighter holds one, held the way a man holds something he has decided to use regardless of skill level, which made him more dangerous than a trained soldier because there was no technique to read, no trained pattern to counter, just the arithmetic of desperation. "It's done, Ronan," Brennan said. His voice was rough. Not cold, genuinely rough. The voice of a man who had been building toward this moment for 2 years and was discovering that the moment, arrived at, felt nothing like he had calculated. The barriers are gone. The clans are an hour out. You can't hold the walls with what you have. Step aside and I can still negotiate terms that keep your people alive. You pulled the garrison off the southern marker, Ronan said, still breathing hard. You opened the last barrier yourself. I gave us leverage. You gave them a road. I gave us a way out of a kingdom that was already dying. Brennan's jaw was set, the muscles in it visible. I have watched this land fail for 8 days, Ronan. I have watched it fail for 2 years, if I'm honest. Since before Celine, since before any of this. I watched you look straight through the woman who was holding it together, and I watched the cracks form, and I made a decision about where I would stand when it fell. You made a decision to help it fall faster. I made a decision to survive it. The ruin was quiet except for Aurelia's breathing behind him, and the wind, and somewhere distant, so distant it was more felt than heard, the movement of a large body of soldiers crossing open ground. Ronan looked at the man he had trusted with 9 years of military command and felt something that was not quite betrayal. Betrayal had already happened with Celine, and it had taken up all the room that shock occupied. This was something different, something more like grief with the sentiment removed. The recognition that a person he had relied on had, at some point he would never be able to precisely locate, made a different calculation about what the future looked like and had simply stopped telling him about it. This was what the inside of power actually looked like, stripped of its ceremony. Not loyalty held by respect, loyalty held by alignment of interest, and when the interest diverged, the loyalty went with the interest, and a king sitting at the center of it would not know until the ground was already gone. Step aside, Brennan said again. No, Ronan said. Brennan moved. He was not a trained fighter, and it showed in everything. The angle of the blade, the footwork, the way he came forward with his weight too far forward, and his offhand doing nothing useful. Ronan caught the blade arm, turned it, and drove Brennan backward into the ruined wall, hard enough to crack the plaster behind his shoulders. The blade went somewhere in the fall. Ronan put his forearm across Brennan's chest and leaned his weight into it and put his face 6 inches from the older man's. The clans can be stopped, Ronan said, breathing hard. Not with walls, with what she's doing right now. He did not look back at Aurelia because he could not afford to. If you have spent 2 years watching this land and this court, then you know what she is. You know what that bond is. And you have 2 seconds to decide whether you're going to call off whatever you set in motion at that garrison, or whether I'm going to find out how fast this ruin can be made into a cell. Brennan looked at him. The calculation in his face was visible. Old habit, the habit of a man who had spent his career assessing military situations, weighing forces and outcomes. Ronan watched him run it and come out the other side of it, somewhere he hadn't expected to arrive. The garrison recall, Brennan said. I can reverse it. Then do it now. Drav is at the eastern entrance. Give him the counter order, in writing, with your seal. And then you stay in this ruin where I can see you until this is over. Brennan looked at him for 1 more second. Then he nodded, once, with the compressed expression of a man swallowing something large. Ronan stepped back. He called Drav from the entrance and watched while Brennan produced his seal and wrote the counter order with the flat, efficient handwriting of a soldier and handed it over without ceremony. Drav took it and ran. Then Ronan turned back to the foundation stone. Aurelia had not moved. She was still on her knees, both palms flat, head down. But something had changed in the quality of it. The desperate, burning expenditure of before had shifted into something more structured, more deliberate. Like a fire that had been running wild and had found a channel and was running straight now, faster and hotter, but in a direction. He crossed to her and crouched beside her without touching her and said, very quietly, "The garrison counter order is out. Drav has it." She did not respond. "Aurelia." "I heard you." Her voice was distant, not dissociated, just far into the work. "The southern barrier is back. I can feel the eastern markers." A pause. Breath. "They're going to take time. The structure is damaged at the foundation of each one. I need to rebuild from the source point and—" She stopped. Her arms were shaking again, fine and constant, the trembling of sustained effort past the point of comfort. I need more time than I may have. He looked at her hands on the stone. He looked at his own hand, which had bled down the wrist and dried into a dark line along the forearm. He pressed his palm flat onto the stone beside hers. The current came back immediately, that unnamed pressure, the circuit finding its connection. He felt Aurelia's breath change when it happened, a slight deceleration. The breathing of a body that has just received support it had stopped expecting. "Tell me what to do," he said. "You're already doing it. That's not enough." "It's more than you know," she said. They stayed like that in the ruined basement with the open sky above them and the wind coming through where the roof had been, and Brennan sitting against the far wall in his own reckoning. Ronan kept his hand on the stone and focused on the pressure running through it, and thought about nothing that was not the stone and the woman kneeling beside him and the current moving between them, which was the oldest and most fundamental thing in this kingdom, and which he had spent 11 years not understanding was also the most necessary. The trembling in Aurelia's arms slowed, then steadied, then stopped. The ground under his knees had changed color. He noticed it gradually, the way you notice dawn, not as a moment, but as an accumulation of moments that eventually crosses a threshold. The ash gray of the dead earth inside the ruin was no longer gray. It was darker, richer, the color of ground that had water moving beneath it. The change spread slowly outward from the foundation stone in the same radial pattern as the cracks in the granite boundary stone in the foothills, but reversed, not fracturing, filling. Aurelia lifted her head. She looked at the ground around them. Then she looked at her hands, which were still raw at the palms, still marked from 8 days of stone and cold, but no longer shaking. She looked at them the way a person looks at something they are assessing for what it can still do, rather than for what it has been through. She looked at Ronan. "The eastern markers are holding," she said. He exhaled. "The clan force will reach the Ashford crossing," she said. "The barriers will stop them, not turn them. We'll still need to negotiate." "I know." "And the crops." She looked at the changed earth around the foundation stone. 3 seasons minimum, possibly 4. The north fields took the worst damage and the recovery will be slow. "I know." She looked at him. Something moved across her face that was neither the stripped clarity of the foothills nor the careful control of the 11 years before it. Something older than both. The expression of a person who has gone through the fire and come out the other side knowing exactly what they are made of. "And then there's the rest of it," she said. "Yes," he said, "which we are not resolving today." "No, not today." She nodded. She took her hands off the stone. She sat back on her heels and looked at the open sky above the ruin and breathed, slowly, deeply, the breathing of a body reclaiming itself after long expenditure. "Help me up," she said. He stood and offered his hand, and she took it, and he pulled her to her feet. She did not let go immediately. She stood for a moment with her hand in his, not with sentiment, just with the practical steadiness of a body that needed one more second before it trusted its own legs. Then she let go and took her own weight and turned toward the ruin's exit without looking back. The Alpha Council convened 3 days later. Not in the palace, what remained of it could not host a formal council session. They met in the capital's civic hall, a building that had been used for court administration before the palace's expansion a century ago, with its lower ceilings and plain stone, and the absence of any of the ceremony that a council chamber accumulated over decades of use. Ronan had chosen it deliberately. He was not interested in ceremony. He stood before the assembled council and told them everything. Not the version that could be shaped into a defensible narrative. Everything. Celine's commissioned deployment, the method used to degrade the bond, the 2 years of manufactured evidence, the witnesses who had been bought and moved out of the kingdom, Brennan's role in the military coordination, the contact within the council's own ranks that Brennan had confirmed in exchange for the counterorder. He laid it on the long, plain table in the civic hall like a field inventory, with no architecture around it and no management of how it landed. The silence that followed was the longest he had ever sat in. War Chief Kyle was the first to speak. "And the Luna's role," he said. "Careful. In the context of what the scholar's report confirmed." "The Luna's role," Ronan said, was to maintain a foundational bond that this kingdom's survival depends on, alone, without support, for 11 years, while this court failed to understand what that maintenance cost or what it required. He looked at each man at the table. That is the only role she played. Any other interpretation that existed in this council was manufactured, and I was the instrument of that manufacture. No one spoke. Celine Voss will answer to the full council under criminal proceedings, Ronan continued. The charges will be documented and the proceedings will be public. The Voss Assembly will receive formal notification. Brennan will answer separately under military tribunal. The council member who served as the internal contact has already been identified. They will be removed and prosecuted. He stopped. He looked at his hands on the table and then back at the council. I am also formally proposing a restructure of this court's governance, he said. A standing council with binding authority in decisions affecting the foundational land. Not advisory, binding. With the Luna holding permanent seat and veto power over any action that touches the kingdom's territorial integrity. He paused. These are not concessions. They are corrections. Kyle looked at him for a moment. You're reducing your own authority. I'm replacing authority I should never have held alone with a structure that might actually work, Ronan said. Those are different things. The council voted. It was not unanimous. It was close enough. Bus. He went to Aurelia that evening. She was in the temporary quarters she had been given in the East Civic Building, a plain room, serviceable, with a south-facing window that looked out over the capital's lower streets. She was at the window when he arrived, not looking out of it, just standing near the light. She had bathed and changed and slept for the better part of 2 days and looked, for the first time in weeks, like a person who had been permitted to stop running. He told her about the council vote. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. A binding seat, she said. Yes. Not ceremonial. Not ceremonial. Veto authority over territorial decisions. Equal standing with the war chiefs on foundational matters. He held her gaze. It should have been the structure from the beginning. The bond was never designed to be maintained by one person without institutional support. The old texts are clear on that. He stopped. The old texts were in the archive I burned. She looked at him. You're doing that thing, she said, where you list your failures as if the listing is the work. He paused. What do you mean? I mean that naming what you did wrong is not the same as understanding it, she said. You named it to the council today. You named it to me in the foothills. You have been naming it since you read the scholar's report. She turned from the window. The naming is necessary. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm saying the work that comes after the naming is longer and harder, and there is no moment where you say it and it becomes resolved. He sat with that. I know, he said finally. Do you? She said, not challenging, genuinely asking. I'm beginning to, he said. That's the honest answer. She looked at him for a long moment with those clear, thorough eyes, the gaze that had always gone past his surface and taken inventory of what was underneath, that he had learned to feel as judgment before he understood it was simply attention. The council seat, she said. I'll take it. I know you will. Not because you offered it. I know that too. She nodded. A single contained nod. The economy of movement that was the most characteristically Aurelia thing she did. The refusal to spend more gesture than the moment required. The recovery will take years, she said. The land, the court's trust, the border relationships, years. Yes. And you and I, whatever we are now, that's not resolved either. That's not something that gets fixed by a council vote. No, he said, it's not. Then that's where we are, she said. We're in the middle of it. Yes. She turned back to the window. The light from the south was going amber, the particular quality of late-day light in autumn, and it caught the edge of her profile and the raw skin at her palms where they rested on the windowsill and the line of her jaw, which was the line of a woman who had come through something enormous and was still standing in it rather than past it. The river came back this morning, she said. I checked the report. I heard. The south fields will be plantable by spring. If we move on the irrigation channels before first frost, We might recover one of the North plots by second season. A pause. I'll need the council to approve the labor allocation. Done. She almost smiled. Not quite. The almost was enough. The ghost of it at the corner of her mouth. The thing that said she was still in there under everything that had happened to her. The woman who had walked into his palace at 17 with 2 trunks and a name people mispronounced on purpose, and had proceeded to hold the whole edifice up with her bare hands for 11 years without once asking for acknowledgement. He stood up. He moved toward the door. Then he stopped, because there was one more thing, and he was not going to build a narrative around it. Aurelia, he said. She didn't turn around. Yes. I am sorry, not for the category of things, for each specific thing. I know what they are. I'm not going to list them at you. You said it right. The listing isn't the work, but I want you to know that I know each one. He put his hand on the doorframe, and that's not a prelude to anything. It doesn't require a response. It's just true. The room was quiet. I know, she said. Her voice was the same as it had always been. Careful, level, calibrated with the precision of a woman who measured what she spent. But underneath it, in the register that she had always used for true things, was something that had not been there before. Not warmth exactly. More like the particular quality of a door that has been closed for a long time and is not open yet, but is no longer locked. He went out. The Voss Assembly proceedings took 4 months. Celine stood before the full Alpha Council in the Civic Hall and answered every question in the same flat, precise voice she had used to build the narrative that had cost the kingdom a year of its life. She did not plead. She did not construct a defense from sentiment. She answered the questions and accepted the findings. And when the council stripped the Voss Assembly of its northern trade rights and imposed a territorial restriction that closed the mountain passes to their commercial routes for 20 years, she received it with the expression of a woman who had made her calculation and was now living at the end of it. Ronan watched her face in that moment. He looked for something. He was not sure what. Some proof of who she had been underneath the architecture, some version of her that the long proceedings had finally exposed. He did not find it. He found only the same controlled surface, the same quality of attention directed outward, the same eyes that watched a room and found its structure. He thought, this is all there is. Not a secret self underneath, not a woman who had been doing terrible things for human reasons he could eventually understand. Just this. A person whose architecture was the person. Capable and deliberate and wrong all the way down in the choices she had made. There was no comfort in it. He had stopped looking for comfort in understanding things correctly. Understanding things correctly was just the work. The comfort, such as it was, came from elsewhere. It came from the river running again. It came from the eastern barrier lights holding steady through the first storms of winter, from the scout reports that stopped carrying the language of collapse and started carrying the language of maintenance. It came from council sessions where Aurelia sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface and her voice even and her judgment consistent, and the war chiefs listening to her the way men listen to someone whose authority they have stopped needing to argue about, because it has proven itself in the most direct way authority can be proven. It came from a morning in late winter when Ronan walked the foundation site alone. The ruin, still open sky where the roof had been, still the blackened stone that he had not begun to rebuild because rebuilding felt like it required a kind of clarity he had not yet earned, and found that the ground inside the old wing was no longer gray. It was dark and rich and alive, and small green things were growing in the cracks between the foundation stones with the absolute indifference to difficulty that living things displayed when conditions finally permitted. He stood in the ruin and looked at the green things and felt something move through him that he did not perform for anyone because there was no one there to perform for. It was not peace. It was something smaller and more durable. The particular quality of a man who has stopped lying to himself and discovered that the truth, even when it is hard, takes up less space than the lie did. The lie had to be maintained. The truth just had to be lived with. He could live with it. He was learning how. In the spring, construction began. Not on the old wing, that came later. On the barrier infrastructure first, the physical markers that anchored the foundational bond to the territorial lines, built now to specification that Aurelia provided from the secondary archive, built to require maintenance rather than sacrifice, built for two rather than one. The Alpha Council met monthly. Aurelia sat at the table. She disagreed with Ronan in the third session over the labor allocation for the Northfield recovery, and was correct, and the council sided with her and Ronan accepted it without ceremony, because that was the structure working the way it was supposed to work. After the session, she walked with him to the Foundation site. She did this sometimes, in the early evening when the day's work was finished, walked the ruin perimeter in the particular attentive way she walked all spaces that mattered to her. Not with him, exactly, alongside him. He had learned the difference. "The builders say the old wing can start by summer," he said. "I know, I approved the resource request." "The archive first," he said, "before the residential sections. I want the records restored." She glanced at him sideways. "That's the right order." "I've been reading the secondary archive in the evenings," he said. "The sections on bond theory, the original covenant structure." He paused. "I should have read them 11 years ago." "Yes," she said. "You should have." No softening of it, no invitation to feel better about it, just the fact, laid flat, the way Aurelia laid all facts. He was beginning to understand that this was not coldness. It had never been coldness. It was the most consistent form of respect she had ever offered him, the refusal to protect him from what was true. He had spent 11 years interpreting it as distance, and it had been, the entire time, the most honest relationship in his court. They stopped at the boundary of the ruin where the old wing's eastern wall still stood, partial, the stone blackened but intact, the first section that would anchor the reconstruction. The evening light came over the top of it and made a long shadow across the ground, and the green things growing in the foundation stones moved slightly in the wind. "Ronan," Aurelia said. "Yes." She looked at the wall, at the green, at the particular quality of a ruin that is beginning, at its edges and its cracks, to be something else. "Don't build the archive where the old one was," she said. "Put it at the center of the new wing, accessible from every corridor, not a room people go to specifically, a room people pass through." He looked at where she was looking. He understood what she meant, not just about the architecture. "All right," he said. The river sound was audible from where they stood, the south tributary running full and cold and continuous. The sound of water that has remembered it was meant to run. The barrier lights on the eastern ridge were visible in the dimming sky, steady and even, the pale blue of something maintained rather than burning. Years later, people in the kingdom would tell the story of the burned palace the way people tell stories that contain the things they most need to remember, with more shape than the actual events had, with the chaos compressed into a lesson that the chaos itself never offered cleanly. They would say, "A king burned his home and learned what home actually was." They would say, "The Luna held the land through the worst of it and claimed her own ground when the worst was done." Both were true. Neither was the whole of it. The whole of it was the years of ordinary work that followed, the council sessions and the field reports and the evenings walking the ruin perimeter, the slow process of two people learning to occupy the same space with honesty rather than performance. The whole of it was unglamorous and incremental, and it did not have a single moment of resolution that anyone could point to and say, "There, that was when it was healed." It was not healed, it was maintained. That was the thing the old texts had been trying to say, Ronan understood now, reading them in the evenings in the secondary archive with the lamp burning low. Not that bonds were made once and held forever. Not that a covenant forged in the right moment was immune to neglect or sabotage, or the slow erosion of a man who stopped paying attention. Every bond was maintained, or it was lost. Every day was a choice to attend or to look away. He had looked away for 2 years, and the cost had been enormous and real, and some portion of it was permanent. He attended now. Not perfectly. Not without error. The council still challenged him. Aurelia still disagreed with him. The kingdom still produced days that had no good options, but differently. With the understanding that authority was not a possession, it was a practice. And the practice required, above everything else, the willingness to look directly at what was true, even when the truth was built from your own mistakes. The evening light thinned. The green things in the foundation cracks moved in the wind. The river ran. Aurelia turned from the ruin and walked back toward the civic hall where the evening's remaining work was waiting, with the measured, unhurried pace of a woman who had somewhere to be and knew the way. Ronan watched her go. Then he turned back to the wall, the blackened stone, the beginning of the reconstruction, the first solid thing he had committed to rebuilding with his eyes open. He put his hand against it. The stone was cold. It was ordinary. It held. He left his hand there for a moment, not performing anything, not asking anything of it, just feeling the weight of it under his palm, the old stone of a kingdom that had come close to dying and had not. Then he took his hand back and followed her inside.